know, Jesus came, he lived, and he made the world a better place for having been here and for having lived here. And yet, he suffered greatly for making the world a better place. He devoted his life to kindness and compassion, but he struck the chord of hostility, even with all that compassion and with all that kindness. He spoke only things that were true and things that were filled with love. And yet, the powers of his day silenced him. And we wonder, why? How does that happen? There's a play, a very simple play. It's called Construction. It was put on by a group of young people, and the Methodist minister writes of having seen that play. He said it starts out with one scene where this group of people are kind of in another worldly place. They're not sure where they are. They're not sure where they are or how they got there or who put them there or what they're supposed to do because they're there. They're just there, and they're kind of confused. And so they get to talking to each other, and they decide that they need to build something. They see some building materials already there for them where they are. So since they're not sure about who they are, where they came from, what they're supposed to do, but here are these building materials, they can need to build something. So they get to talking about what they should build, and somebody says, we should build a swimming pool. That would be fun. Somebody else says, we should build a hospital. And somebody else says, no, let's build a clubhouse. And so they argue about what they should build, but they know they ought to build something. And then one of them says, you know, we're not the only ones here. There are other people all the way around here. Have you noticed that? Have you heard them? I've heard them, and I've seen some of them, and I know they're here, and I'm not sure about them. We're not sure what kind of people they are. We're not sure what they're going to do to us. So I think we ought to build a wall to keep these people out because we're not sure about it. So everybody agrees. They get scared. They get panicky. Yes, let's build a wall. So they gather up their building material and they start to build a formidable wall. And as they're building the wall and it's well along, they look and here comes a stranger toward them. He's a young man. And he comes to where they are and he introduces himself as a builder. And he said, I have come from the one who put you here. And I have brought with me a blueprint of what you ought to build. And I want to share it with you. He said, it is not a wall that you ought to be building that keeps people out, but it ought to be a bridge to bring people together. And they kind of look at each other and say, what? We've already got the wall mostly built. What does he mean it ought to be a bridge, you know? And they get to arguing and they say, who does he think he is that he can come here and tell us what to do? We think we know what we ought to do, and we think we need to build a wall. We're afraid. But he keeps saying, not a wall. I've brought the blueprints from the one who put you here. It's bridges that bring people together. And they get in a fight and an argument among themselves, and they decide that this young builder who has come must be a spy. He's dangerous. They can't trust him. And suddenly they attack him, and the lights go out in the room where the play is, and the music gets louder and rumbles, and you hear screaming and shouting from the crowd who has become a mob, and then there's silence and darkness. And then one spotlight comes on, and the young builder has been crucified. He is on a cross. And then the people shrink back at horror for what they have done. And one of them says, we must learn. We must learn from this. We cannot go on crucifying the truth. Well, you see, that's pretty much the way we are, isn't it? When you look at the play, it's about us also. Because we continue to build walls to separate us and keep people out, when we ought to be building bridges that bring people together. You remember the prayer of St. Francis? I know you do. Let me share it with you this morning, because it says, this is what we're supposed to do. Lord, make me an instrument of thy peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. O divine Master, grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive. It is in pardoning that we are pardoned. It is in dying that we are born to eternal life. That really doesn't sound bad, does it? And you know he got in trouble for saying those kinds of things? That when we say to ourselves, that's what we're supposed to do, that strikes a chord of hostility deep down in us. He disturbed people. He still does. You ever been out in the woods and kicked over an old log that had been out there for a long time that's rotten? And all these little creatures under it, when you move the log, start rushing around and running around. And if you could hear them, they'd be saying, let us alone. Let us get back under here where it's dark. And we don't have to see the light. It's bothering us. It's disturbing us. And that's the kind of effect God has on us sometimes. Disturbs us. And we want to crawl back in the dark and put the walls up instead of the bridges. You know the Great Commission, go make of all disciples. That didn't get him in trouble. You know what got him in trouble? The Great Permission. When he said, I'm going to give you permission to do some things that you ought to do. This got him in trouble. He said, I give you permission to forgive each other. That's what you ought to do. Forgive each other. You have my permission to do this. That was new. The law said when he came, if somebody breaks my little finger on my left hand, then I'll break his little finger on his left hand. Now, I can't break two fingers because that's retribution. That's not fair. But I'll do exactly to him what he did to me. That was the religious law. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Break my finger, I get to break your finger. And that was the option. He comes along and says, wait a minute. I give you another option. I give you permission to forgive. We studied last Sunday night one of Jesus' great parables on forgiveness in our Bible study. There weren't many of us here, so a good story is worth repeating. I'm going to repeat a story that I told Sunday night's congregation. It came from a movie, Stars in My Crown, an old black and white movie. And in that movie, there's an old black man who has a farm. And he's lived on that farm all of his life. He was born there, and his family had that farm before him. And they discovered some precious metal on that farm. And so everybody wanted to buy his farm, and he didn't want to sell it. Of course, that was home. They pressured him to sell that farm. And he kept saying, no, it's home. And then one night his barn burned down. And he still said no. And then one night somebody shot into his house, and he said, no, I'm not selling my home and my farm. And then he got the word that they were going to hang him one night by sunset. Methodist preacher in town hears all this that's going out and goes out to talk to him. Visit with him, and that afternoon the mob from town comes out, and they've got their hoods on and their sheets. And the old man is dressed in his best clothes, and he goes out on the front porch. And he says, I'm not afraid, and I'm ready to die, if that's what has to be. But he says, I have given the preacher my last will, and I want him to read it to me. The preacher has written the will down, and he stands out on the front porch reading the will, and he leaves the farm to the banker, who really wants that farm. And the banker is standing in the mob. And then he leaves his old hunting gun to another man in town who had learned to hunt with that gun. He's in the crowd too. He leaves his fishing pole to another one. he leaves everything he has to different members of that mob. And they can't take it. Ashamed, they finally turn and walk out of the yard. And then the preacher's grandson has been standing in the edge of the yard. And he comes up to his granddaddy on the porch and says, "Grandpa, what kind of will was that?" And his granddaddy